Saturday Morning Live on News Radio 1040 WHO. I'm your host, Dave Bohl, and I could not be more excited to share with our listeners a portion of the conversation I had this week with Dr. Ed Thomas, a fascinating person and an expert in physical fitness and physical training. One of the most interesting guests I've ever spoken with. Dr. Ed Thomas, thank you so much for joining me. Before we dive into a whole range of topics on physical education, can you give us a little bit of information about your background?
I started studying exercise science in 1963, eventually landed at the University of Iowa, started teaching there, judo and yoga and weight training. I was in Korea for a couple of years, studied there, studied in Burma. I was a Fulbright in Burma and Thailand, Korea, and I taught at the University of Iowa, Northern Illinois University, Graceland, Upper Iowa University, Fort Benning. I was with the Army Physical Fitness School at Fort Benning through most of the 90s. When I left, they called me the Army's smartest physical fitness expert, but that all goes back to my childhood, because I was born and raised in Davenport, and we had one of the best Turner halls in the country back then. That's a German system of gymnastics, and we had a nice opera hall. But it was a really highly developed system of physical training, and I started studying that when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Started training in judo in 1960 when I was about 15. So I've been immersed in all of this for years.
That really is an incredible career, and we're going to dive into the details of it here in a moment. But this is not your first time on WHO Radio. You were interviewed years ago by longtime WHO talk show host Jan Michelson.
Yes, he contacted me. I was with the Iowa Department of Education. I was the health, physical education, and substance abuse prevention subject matter expert for all the K through 12 public and private schools in the state. And he reached out, and I think he'd read something that I had written, but we had numerous telephone conversations, and then we went on the air.
Well, it is an honor to have you back here on WHO. Now, you are an expert in physical fitness, have spent many, many decades studying the subject, and something that has come up over the last few years is the number of people who would be interested in joining the military but can't pass a military physical fitness test. So what are we doing wrong in terms of our physical fitness culture here in the U.S. that we're seeing this problem?
That's an important question. The golden era of American physical culture is from 1885 until 1920. And those systems that we used came from Europe. Immigrants brought systems of physical training with them. The Germans brought one, the Swedes, the Czechs had a good one. The French had their system. They brought all these systems over, but of course then they began to battle with each other because there was this new field called physical education, and they all wanted a piece of it. So they began to battle it out over which system was the best. They call it the battle of the system, but we then abandoned those systems, and we began to focus on a more Darwinian approach, which was competitive sports and games, survival of the fittest mentality. And so we basically dismantled these beautiful systems of physical training. A gymnasium at the turn of the century was filled with equipment, but when the sports came along, we had to get rid of all of it and kick them outside. That's when the playground movement began in the early 1900s, and we were left with sports and games, and it's been a disaster. It's not that sports and games are unimportant. They're one-third of the formula, actually, of physical education. There are three content areas. There's the restorative, which are the techniques that bring the body toward its highest state of readiness and compensate for the stresses of daily life. Then there's the martial component, which in a civilized society every child should learn. I think you're a judoka, right? You practice judo.
Correct.
Yeah, that's the principle. Here in Iowa, of course, wrestling was our martial art when I was growing up to begin with. So there's a restorative, a martial, and the pedagogical of the sports and the games and the theory and the dance. We focused primarily on the sports and games, and we lost all of that knowledge of the restorative, or what we would call physical training.
I'm speaking with Dr. Ed Thomas here on News Radio 1040 WHO, an expert on physical education. Now, Dr. Thomas, one thing I wanted to ask you is I've been to Russia a couple of times to train judo, and something I noticed when I was there is that their athletes are both nimble and flexible and fast and also very strong. They're both. And I think in the U.S. we get a lot of, say, a figure skater or a sprinter who's very nimble, very fast, not necessarily very strong, or we get a power lifter who can move a lot of weight but is not very limber and flexible. And yet the Russian athletes that I trained with while I was in Moscow were both. How does that happen?
I was a teenager in 1960, high school, and we were just blown away with how athletic the Soviet youth were. And on my YouTube channel, I've got a documentary about that. Via Militaris, Viamilitaris is my YouTube channel. And you can see what they're doing. They were using those older methods. They were using them better than we. They held on to all of that stuff. They held on to that way of training.
Now, you've had an amazing career teaching physical fitness across the world, including starting a school in Burma, now Myanmar. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yes, I was approached by some people from the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Northern Illinois University, and they said, you know, if you apply for a Fulbright to Burma, you'll get it. I applied, and I learned that they wanted somebody with a martial arts background and a knowledge of history of physical culture. And I worked for the National Department of Physical Education of Burma, and I think we had 30 sports organizers from all over the country. And then I ended up working in Thailand for the last 3 months and did something similar for them.
This was truly an incredible conversation with Dr. Ed Thomas. We got into so much more. Again, we talked for almost 45 minutes. I will be posting the full conversation to the Saturday Morning Live page on the iHeartRadio app as well as our Facebook page. We talked about calisthenics and where even that word comes from. Did you know that you can use a harmonica to help yourself breathe better? And what can you do if you're past your athletic prime, but you still want to keep yourself fit as you age? We talked about all of that. It was an incredible conversation, and it will soon be available in its entirety. It's nearly hour-length entirety on our Saturday Morning Live page on the iHeartRadio app. I encourage our listeners to follow us there, and you can also follow us on Facebook. I will share the link there as well. A fantastic conversation. More coming up on Saturday Morning Live, News Radio 1040 WHO.